Thank you very much. Our last, not really last song, but this is the offering song.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here again, to see you all again. It's been a couple of months since I was here. Yes, as Brother Francis said, I'm working my way through the family pledge. There's more than enough material there for years of sermons, I realized. And so, anyway, moving on to family pledge number 3, the 3 great kingships. So just to repeat, where are we? Click. What is the family pledge? So, as Father said, you must understand the family pledge is the result of extracting from the principle all the essential contents needed to establish families. And that's why when you read the family pledge, it's just full of these little sound bites. It's incredibly condensed little phrases. And as Father said, it's made up entirely of the essence of the providence of restoration. And of course, the providence of restoration is recounted most profoundly in the Bible. So you must base your lives on it wherever you go and whatever you do. The most important thing in all the verses of the family pledge is true love. And then in the principle, it also says, fallen people can never find the path that leads to life without understanding the particulars of the providence of restoration. Herein lies the reason why we must study the principle of restoration in detail. Well, sometimes people wonder, why does William keep on going on about the Bible and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judaism, all these things? It's because that's the root from which we came, the root from which true parents came. And that's what Father studied, the Bible. And that's why we need to understand these things in great detail. So we just read out family pledge number 3. I'm not going to read it again because we just read it. So I thought, well, over these little phrases here, the 4 great realms of heart as one, 3 great kingships, or the realm of the royal family, chose 3 great kingships. But I was thinking about, well, Her Majesty the Queen, she just passed away. And one of the things she was very concerned about was lineage. What's the most important job of a king or a queen? Get an heir. Make sure they have a good heir who's going to become a good king or queen after them. This is the most important thing. Why is that so important? Sorry?
Keep the lineage going.
Yeah, but keep the lineage. More than that. Why is it important for a king to do that? Stability. That's right, because if you don't have an heir, if you have a monarchy and you don't have a child, you don't have an heir, then what happens next? Who's going to become the next monarch? And that's why sometimes within history there've been wars. So in Britain, in England, we experienced the War of the Roses, lots of arguments about who should be the king, which family should the king come from. And of course that was the main reason why Henry VIII wanted a divorce. He wanted to get married because he loved his wife, Catherine, very deeply, but she bore him a daughter and he wasn't sure that a woman would be able to become a good monarch and could provide the stability that England needed after the Wars of the Roses, which is when he himself or his father became the king. So he didn't want England plunged back into civil strife and civil war. So that's why he wanted to divorce his first wife and get married to a younger woman so he could have a son. Anyway, as it turned out, Queen Elizabeth I was a great monarch, but she herself never married. And so as she got older and older, and so her courtiers were saying, you should marry somebody. But she was very concerned. Welcome, Mark. She was very concerned about who she should marry. So the King of Spain wanted to marry her, but then England didn't want to come under the rule of Spain. And so it's very, very difficult for her to find somebody, appropriate person to marry. So she never married. But then, after she died, or before she died, people were wondering, well, what should we do? How are we going to resolve this issue without being plunged back into civil war? And so it was decided by her advisors that we should invite the King of Scotland, James VI of Scotland, to become James I of England and Scotland together, the union of the crowns. And so that meant there was stability. And it also went a long way towards establishing a peaceful relationship between England and Scotland, which had been going on for conflict for a long time. So that's why it's so important to find a good heir, not just for the lineage, but also for stability in the country. And so that's why this is one of the last photos. I think this is on this Platinum Jubilee, maybe? Can't remember now. So that's why the Queen then was very concerned about having a good heir. And we can see how Charles has grown up. Obviously went into the armed forces first of all, but then he involved in a huge number of public activities within the country, setting up Prince's Trust, a huge range of things that he's been doing. And people often say it's been the longest apprenticeship in history, 50 years preparing to get a job. And only getting his job, that which he'd been preparing for when he was over 70. So there was Charles, and of course, I remember when I was, a long time ago, I remember after Charles and Diana got married, and there was all this glitzy kind of romantic thing, and the marriage and everything. And then people were saying, well, the Queen should now abdicate and let Charles become the king. And there's a lot of pressure from the literati and the intelligentsia that the Queen was getting old. We want to have the Queen was getting old. We should have a young king. Anyway, the Queen, as you know, she made this promise when she's 21 years old to serve until she died. And then that's what she did. But then, can you imagine if Charles had become the king at that time, and later on, while he was the king, his marriage had broken up and gone through all that turmoil, it would have been really a disaster. Yeah? So to be honest, it's better, generally speaking, to have an old person becoming a king, because they're wiser. And one of the things that people talk about the Queen, they say she had so much wisdom. She was regarded as being, by statesmen, presidents, other kings and prime ministers, as being the wisest person in the world, because she had a vast amount of experience from when she became Queen, when she was only 26. Which I met all American presidents from the time of Truman, all the presidents, prime ministers. She traveled to over 100 countries. So she had a wealth of experience. And that's the kind of person you want to have as as a king or a queen. And so, although Charles is old, but he has a lot of experience. He is the only head of state in the world today who actually met all the presidents of America since the time of President Nixon. And so again, a lot of wealth of experience there. And so again, people looking towards William, and again you get the silly people saying, well, Charles should just not become the king, he should let William become the king instead. But actually, there's a lot of wisdom in an older person becoming the monarch and continuing this sort of pattern of stability. And so William seems to be turning out well with Catherine, and then you got George. So there we got not just the 3 great kingships, you got the 4 great kingships. You got these 4 generations. And so that's very hopeful for a country, that sense of stability, that sense that there's a good leadership in the country. And so, as I said in my last talk, Lancaster, that's why in the national anthem we sing, God Save the King. Because we want the king to be saved by God, to be able to have a deep relationship with God, so that he makes wise and good decisions. And that's the most important thing. So where does this idea of the 3 kingships come from? Well, this is Moses. He was a shepherd, as you know, and he was a shepherd for 40 years. It's interesting to see that all the people that God chose, they were all shepherds. Abraham was a shepherd, Isaac was a shepherd, Jacob was a shepherd, Joseph wasn't. That's another story. Moses was a shepherd, David was a shepherd, and of course Jesus himself, he often used that metaphor of being a good shepherd. So why do you think God always chooses shepherds?
They're leading.
Sorry?
They're leaders. They're leading.
Why are they leaders?
They have to care for the sheep.
They have to care for the sheep. Okay. And? Who's in charge of a shepherd?
God.
What? Who?
God.
God.
If you're standing out there on the hillside,
That's right.
and something's coming to eat your sheep,
Yes.
there's nothing else, man. It's only God.
Yes, the shepherds are there by themselves, out on the hills with their sheep, looking after the sheep, tending the sheep, protecting the sheep from lions and wolves, and there's nobody who can tell them what to do. Nobody else, they don't have a manager. So they're out there on the hills, looking at the stars, gazing at the stars, and wondering. They start getting involved in religious questions. There's nobody to talk to except God and the sheep, of course. And so they start to engage in a relationship, in a conversation with God. And that's how they develop this very profound relationship with God. They're out alone with God all the time, so when they go home. And so I think that's one of the reasons. As opposed to somebody who's working in a city, they've always got a manager. They've always got someone who should telling them what to do. As Gillian smiles there, you work in the NHS and all these sort of big structures, you realise actually it's not easy dealing with all these awkward customers, bosses usually. Okay, so Moses then, who's a shepherd, then he praying and thinking a lot about the world and everything. And then one day he saw this burning bush and he approached it, and God said, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this Moses hid his face because he's afraid to look at God. So that's how God introduced himself. God didn't introduce himself as, "I'm the God, the creator of the universe. I'm the power behind the universe." God introduced himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A personal God who knew people personally, had a personal relationship. Well, here you've got this thing, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the origin of the idea of the three great kingships. So, why then did God choose Abraham? Not just because he's a shepherd, but it says there in the Bible, "For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he promised him." So God didn't choose Abraham because he's a great king. He didn't choose Abraham because he's incredibly wealthy or because he's a great general or soldier or anything. He chose Abraham because he will teach his children to keep the way of the Lord, to worship God, to develop their relationship with God in the same way that he did, and to do that by doing what is right and just. So that's why God chose Abraham, because he knew Abraham would teach his children to be right and just, to be fair and just, to live a good life and to be good people. And so you might think, well, okay, what did Abraham teach his children? What was the content of Abraham's teaching? What did Abraham teach his children before they went to bed at night? What were the stories that he told his children? Well, I think myself, this is entirely my theory, there's no scholarship to back it up whatsoever. I think Abraham taught his children the stories we find in Genesis, of the creation of the world in 7 days, 6 days, and the resting on the seventh day. I think Abraham told his children the stories of Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel, and Noah, and all these stories. The reason I think that is because these stories came from Babylon, the Gilgamesh epic, which Abraham would have been very familiar with, but I think he retold these stories in a way which transmitted and expressed different values. Well, I'm not going to go into all that. So I think that was what Abraham was teaching his children. Because one of the great questions is, if God exists, why is there evil and suffering in the world? Why do people die? Why do the good people seem to suffer the most and die? Why are there wars? Why the famine? Why is all this suffering? And so that is what the story in Genesis explains. It explains that God is good, but that evil came into the world through the fall. And so because the importance of free will then. And also, what does it mean to be just? So if you remember when God came along and it became clear that it looked like God was going to arrange for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, what did Abraham do? He didn't say, well, that's great. They're such nasty people, they deserve to be wiped out. Instead, Abraham argued with God. Shouldn't the judge of the world do justice? Is it really fair that, if there are 50 good people in the city, that the innocent should die together with the wicked? And so engaged in a long argument with God, wrestling with God about this, and argued God down to 10 good people. So that was an example of Abraham having a very strong sense of justice, really concerned and caring about the people who were downtrodden, the people who were suffering. And another thing that Abraham taught his children, or sort of practice of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, which is another part of the pledge. Also, how did he treat his children? Yeah, he had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And did he want to get rid of Ishmael? He didn't. When Sarah, for good reason, suggested that Hagar and Ishmael should leave the family, then Abraham was really upset and really didn't want that. He loved his son Ishmael. And so he argued with God about this, and God said, in immortal words, which I surprised on hanging up in every house. God said to Abraham, do you know what he said to Abraham? What did God say to Abraham? What?
Don't do what your wife says.
Don't. No. What did God say to Abraham when Abraham was saying, I really don't want to send Ishmael away, he's my son as well. What did God say to Abraham?
Follow your wife.
What?
Follow your wife.
Yeah, listen to your wife. Yeah, so I'm just amazed you don't find this on little things everywhere. Anyway, it's really good advice, and it's one that I should take more myself, to be honest. Listen to your wife. Anyway, so he loved, and he wanted to treat his sons fairly. And so he argued with God until God said, okay, I will also bless Ishmael. He'll have 12 sons, and a great nation will come from him as well. So that was his heart. He wanted everyone to be treated fairly and justly. But then you can imagine that relationship to Abraham and Isaac is probably quite complicated. What did Abraham do to Isaac? He bound him and was about to sacrifice him. I mean, that's kind of complicated, isn't it? It's kind of a very traumatic experience that both Abraham and Isaac went through there. I'm not going to go into that story, it's a really important story. But through that story, God was emphasizing the importance of the value of the individual, that every single human being belongs to God. That Abraham was having to acknowledge that Isaac was not only his son, first of all, he's God's son, God's child, and through this, then God wanted to abolish the very evil practice of child sacrifice. And people only thought they had the right to sacrifice their children because people thought children are their property. I own my children. I have the right to tell my children what to do and decide everything about them because they're my property, they belong to me. And in the ancient world, people had the right to sell their children into slavery if they wanted to. They had the right to put their children to death if they would be disobedient and naughty. And they had the right to sacrifice their children. Why do people sacrifice children? As a burnt offering, because worshipping God, you want to offer to God that which is most precious to you. And so people would think, well, there's nothing more precious to me than my child, so I'm going to sacrifice my child. It's horrible, evil practice which God hated. And it's all based upon a complete misunderstanding of the relationship between parents and children. Because parents don't own their children. Children are God's property. Children belong to God. So nobody has a right to sacrifice anybody, because nobody owns anybody. So this then became the turning point at the beginning, the theological beginning of the end of slavery. If every single human being is God's property and belongs to God, how is it possible to have slavery? It's theft. It's wrong. And so it's a great evil. So this is the beginning of that. These are the kind of teachings that came from Abraham. So the binding Isaac was part of that God was establishing the fact that actually no human being has the right to sacrifice children. So there's no child sacrifice in the Bible. Again, the relationship between Isaac and Jacob is also complicated. You got the whole story there with Jacob and Esau and Isaac. But the thing is, somehow, this faith of Abraham, the understanding of Abraham, was passed on to his children and to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. Still, 4,000 years later, we still find people following the teachings and the practice of Abraham. So what was it that he was passing on? Basically, what is the Bible? What is Genesis? It's just a load of stories about a family. So this is the secret of happy families, which is what we want. The single most important thing you can do for your family may be the simplest of all. Develop a strong family narrative. A strong family narrative, that means telling stories about your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, where you came from, where they came from. So a family narrative connects children to something larger than themselves. It helps them to make sense of how they fit into the world that existed before they were born. It gives them the starting point of an identity. That in turn becomes a basis of confidence. It enables children to say, "This is who I am. This is a story of which I'm a part. These are the people who came before me and whose descendant I am. These are the roots of which I am the stem reaching upward towards the sun." So that basically is why the Bible is just a load of stories. It's not ethical teaching like you'd find in Confucianism or amongst the Stoics or the philosophers like Aristotle. The Bible is just a load of stories. And these stories are stories about families. And it's not stories necessarily about happy families, because there's all kinds of stuff goes on in these families. There's murder, there's rape, there's incest, all kinds of stuff goes on. But these stories are told and recounted for people to understand who they are, where they came from, and for people to be able to learn the lessons from the mistakes that their ancestors made, but also the good things that they did. So one of the main stories, of course, in the Genesis is this sibling rivalry. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Ishmael and Isaac, Joseph and his brothers. And it carries on, David and Jonathan. So you can see here different ways in which these sibling relationships turn out. And so people can learn from this. Okay, if I treat my older brother like this, he might get really upset and angry with me, and he might bump me on the head. And there's all kinds of stories there about how siblings should relate to each other. So this is really important. So I think this is very important also for us. Here, Father talked about 3 great kingships. He said, "Once I become a grandfather, I find my grandchildren are even more lovable than my own children. And the people I long for the most are not my children, but my grandchildren." That's how it is. Is that how it is, Ron? Inge?
No.
No? Okay, how is it then?
I hadn't thought about that, sorry.
It's all right. But it's something to think about, you know. It's when you got grandchildren, you don't have to change the nappies because the parents do that. It's once, and also when you get tired of them, you just, you know, pass them back to the parents. So in one sense, it's a lot more joyful, you're a lot more relaxed. And anyway, the sense that the parents should be teaching the children about this, that and the other, and you don't have to do that yourself, you can just enjoy them and spoil them sometimes. So again, Father said, when we love and respect when we love and respect our grandparents, what we're actually doing is actually inheriting the past and learning about the past. We learn about the present from our parents. We love, and when we love and cherish our children, we're in fact living as we learn about the future. If you want to get your know how to fix your iPhone, you ask your kids. Learning about the future. What is it that we inherit from our grandmother and our grandfather, from our mother and father? What is the lineage that we inherit? So what is it we're inheriting here? Father said the answer is true love. True love is a thing that we inherit. My grandfather, my grandmother may be old, but they become one through true love. Likewise, my mother and father are one in true love, so naturally we too should become like them and inherit the future. You have to understand that without becoming a true family on the absolute level, you cannot inherit, you cannot connect the future. And that's so important. You can see there the Queen, she was, and Prince Philip, they weren't just grandparents, they were grandparents and even great-grandparents. And when both Philip and the Queen died, then people testified a lot about the incredible love that they had for each other. And then, when you look at their own children, their marriages didn't work out well, except for Edward and Sophie, and Charles and Andrew and Anne, they all got divorced. But then Charles remarried and is very happy and very stable now. Anne also remarried and is also very happy and very stable now. And so Andrew, anyway, there's always anyway, he had his own problems. But still, his own relationship with his wife, who he divorced, is very good. And his relationship with his children. So one of the things that always struck me was the royal family. They always celebrated Christmas together in Balmoral. They always went there. They always went there to be the Queen, not just because she's the Queen, but because she was their mum, or their grandmother, or their great-grandmother. And so even though they had problems within their marriage, their relationship with their parents remained incredibly strong. And they were all incredibly loyal. And that was one of the things that struck me, the incredible importance of that. So they really loved their parents and grandparents. And so even though they went through their own difficulties, they still remained stable people with good families themselves. And that's quite remarkable, really, to be honest, especially when you're doing everything with everything you do in the newspapers and on the media, every little thing you say. So these are really important then. So how to put this into practice? Well, one thing is to visit and attend grandparents. I'm still very lucky. I have my dad's still alive, but I had grandparents, but they always seemed to me to be very old. They were always incredibly Victorian, because they were Victorian, and it was always very distant. I never felt close to them. And then they died basically between when I think one of my grandfathers died when I was about 10, and then while I was a teenager, my other grandparents died as well. So I never became very close to them. So one of the things which I really appreciated with my own family is that we've been able to spend a lot of time with our parents. So when we lived in Russia for 7 years, and every year we used to come back, and Ruth and the children used to stay with her parents for a month or so every year. And so my children became incredibly close to Ruth's parents, because they just lived with them and just enjoyed being with them. And playing in the garden and everything. And then my mother always used to come and stay with us twice a year when we lived in England. She came to visit us in Russia, came to stay with us in England twice a year, she always came for Christmas, and she always came for Wimbledon, when she monopolized the television. And that's the way it was. But also my children became incredibly close to my mother. My parents separated 30 years ago. Anyway, so now my children also become very close to my father, who's still alive, 94. They go and visit him. And so this is a little bit about me. This is my 3 generations there. That's my grandfather. my father and myself. As you can see, my grandfather there, when I was 1 year old, he was really old himself. So I never grew close to him. But then thanks. So that's my dad, and me, and Robert, and Charlotte. So again, you've got 4 generations. You see how happy my dad is to be there. So I went to see my dad on Friday, because I haven't seen him for a while. I'm going to Slovakia next week. And his first question was, "Did you come by yourself?" And he was just so disappointed that it was just me. Because you can see what he really wants to see is his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. And every time I go and see him, and I'm not bringing anybody with me, "Is it only you? Just you came? You know, where are the others? They're much more fun than you." Anyway, so he's so happy when his grandchildren, and especially his great-grandchildren, come to visit. And it was very interesting. So when Charlotte, our granddaughter, was born, and just that time when he went to visit, then my father said, "I'm going to set up a trust fund for my great-grandchildren." And I thought, for their education. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would my father want to be setting up a trust fund for the education of his great-grandchildren? And I thought about this for a while. It took me a while to remember. And then I remembered that my own grandfather, in his will, he set up a trust fund for, set money aside for my education and my sister's education. And at the time I thought, well, that's nice. But it's only much later that I realized why he did that. So my grandfather, his father was a priest in the Church of England and a teacher. So fortunately, my grandfather sat an exam and got a scholarship. So he was able to complete his education at Merchant Taylors. And then he got a scholarship to go to Oxford. And then when he finished at Oxford, then he went to work in Burma. He spent 30 years working for the Burma Trading Company, living in Burma and Thailand, where he got malaria a few times. The reason why he went to work abroad, because he could earn more money working abroad than he could in England, because he had to send money home to support his mother and his younger brother and his younger sister. And so so when my father went to school, went to Oxford, then my father often said, you know, he most of the time he was hungry, didn't have any money. And so my father, my parents were able to afford to send my sister and myself to good schools. But my grandfather was concerned that if his son died, if my dad died, he was concerned that would there be enough money for us to complete our education. And so that's why my grandfather set money aside in his will, which I inherited. And then my father then was always asking me, when my children were at university, can you afford to send them to university? You know, and I said, well, yes, they're taking out this huge loan. But he was always concerned about that, you know, about whether I was able to support my children and their education. And so I think that's why he thought, well, okay, I'm going to set up a trust fund for my great-grandchildren's education. And so I realized that is like the family story, the value of education within our family, the importance of education been passed on through all these generations. So after that, I said to my son Robert, I said, when your grandchildren ask you about your grandfather, what will you tell them? And Robert said, I don't know. What should I tell my grandchildren about my grandfather? I said, tell them that story. Tell them the story of why your grandfather set up money for your own children, and that connects you back to your great-great-grandfather. So connecting back here through many generations of lineage. And so this is the way in which values then are passed on through the family, through these kind of stories about the good things, but also about the bad things. We're trying to understand why don't we get on with that side of the family, uncle what's his name, or, you know, to understand all these things, but also to be able to restore all these things. We need to know the family stories. It helps to understand where we come from, the values of our parents, our grandparents, and these are the values that we should be passing on. The best way to do it isn't just through a list of little sayings, oh, you should do this, you should do that. It's through stories that we can pass these things on in the most best way. So this is another part of my story. This is my, this lady here, right at the end there, with her hat, that's my mother. That's my grandmother. That's my great-grandmother. And that's my great-great-grandmother. And that's my great-grandfather. So I think this is our house in Petticoat. It's the oldest house in Petticoat. My great-grandfather was one of the people who established the first new settlement in the Holy Land in the middle of the 19th century. Anyway, so I show this story, this picture to my children as well, and tell them about all these different characters, who they are, where they came from. This was an old little lady here. She came from Russia, Russian Jew. So when my mother went to stay with her, when she was a child for a few months, for whatever reason, she came home speaking Russian. She'd forgotten how to speak English or Hebrew or anything else. And these are all just parts of the story. And so for me, these are all incredibly significant because they all affect my understanding and sense of who I am, where I come from, but also what I should do with my life, and a sort of sense of historic obligations that I might have, which is one of the reasons why I got involved in this project of publishing books of spiritual moral education in Palestine, because of connection that I had with my I'm not going to tell that story, with my grandfather's colleague who was a Palestinian. Well, the son of my grandfather's colleague, he was a Palestinian. So these are all parts of this idea of the three great kingships, how to pass on the tradition through the generations. And that's one of the great successes of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. It's one thing to be able to have this personal encounter experience with God yourself, but the thing is how to pass this on to one's children and to one's grandchildren and one's great-grandchildren. So this sort of, not only a physical lineage carries on, that's the easy part. The difficult part is a spiritual lineage, the lineage of stories, the lineage of values, the lineage of faith in that sense. That's the hard part, as we know ourselves. For our own second generation, it's been very difficult for us to be able to pass on our own faith to them, such that they feel part of this kind of story. They feel, oh, this is my part in this story. So my own experience when I first heard the principle was, now I understand who I am, because now I understand my part in God's providence. And when I understood my part in God's providence, then I understood how I should live. So if you understand who you are, then you'll understand what you should do. And who we are is decided by our lineage. Who are we? We're the sons and daughters of God. We come from a particular lineage that lived a certain way. And so we are, we're going to write this particular chapter. We don't write the whole book. There are lots of chapters that came before us. We have our own chapter to write. And then we want our children and grandchildren to carry on writing more chapters in this story. And so that's why Father said that we should all write our autobiography. Often I find, children, they don't really want to listen. Oh, boring old dad, just talking about this, that and the other. But, if one writes it down, then basically one day, hopefully, they'll pick it up and read about it. And so I think it's very good to write one's autobiography, and more and more people are doing that within our generation, writing the stories of their lives, their experiences with God, and how they joined, and all the things they did. And these are remarkable stories, remarkable things that people did. I just had some friends of Sean and Jess, a friend of Sean Jess, who's famous Sean and Jess, just came to visit us about a week ago. Anyway, when I found out what her surname was, I realized I'd met her about 25 years ago in Tajikistan, where her parents had been missionaries. And so she was only a child, so she didn't remember me, I didn't remember her personally, but I remember visiting her family when I was working there. And then, anyway, it was really interesting for her to tell the stories then, because also my children were there in Russia with us as well. And so for them to exchange stories, what it was like to be in a Russian school, how they used to get slapped round the head, and if they weren't behaving themselves, and this, that, and the other. And they were able to share these stories with each other. And, then she was telling about, well, how they used to hear bombs going off and gunfire and things. And eventually her family left Tajikistan, Dushanbe, because, the political situation became very dangerous. And then it became, then my children were able to become a bit more aware of the kind of things that we did, the kind of risks we took going out as missionaries into these incredibly inhospitable, challenging places of the fall of communism. And some people actually gave their lives in this cause. And so it's good for our children then to understand these things as well, and often to hear it from other people usually. But anyway, it's good to write your autobiography. It's hard work, writing a book. So if you can't do that, I realise that a much easier thing to do is just to talk. So get out a family album. I've got loads from my mother, and you just select some photographs, and then you just put them on PowerPoint, chronologically, going back. If you've got pictures of your grandparents and your parents and yourself growing up as a child, and the different places you went to, different things, and then also about how you met your parents, about blessing, about your own children, and just put together a PowerPoint presentation, about 100 slides, and then just give this by Zoom. And if you're giving this by Zoom, then you just click every now and then. This is all I do when I teach. You just click on the next slide, a picture comes up, and you talk about it. When you've got run out of things to say about it, you just press click and you talk about the next one. And it's a very easy way just to tell the story of your life without having to go through the whole bother of writing all down. You just speak to these different pictures. Now, if you can do it just by yourself, that's amazing. But if you can do it with a few other people, want to listen to your testimony, and you just record it all on Zoom, and all the pictures are there, along with the commentary, and that's the sort of thing that your children or your grandchildren or great-grandchildren would probably want to watch and look at and listen to. Because again, it gives them a sense of who they are and where they come from, and that's the most important thing, is doing that. So for me, this is a practical way of trying to think, okay, every week, or whenever it is, I recite the family pledge and I say, 3 great kingships. How am I going to do that? How can I substantiate the idea of the 3 great kingships in my family? So for me, that's one way. I haven't got around to doing it yet, but that's what I'm planning to do, is to do that. And if you want to, you can always go and, the software just to change, sorry, I've got chemo brain, sorry, can't find the words. The software which should transcribe your little, your talk and your commentary into words, and you can go and edit it if you want to publish it as a book or a pamphlet or something. So these are sort of practical ways I think about how to put the 3 great kingships into practice in one's own family, to try and pass on this tradition, the sense of who we are, how God called us, and hopefully maybe our children will feel that and feel some sense of calling to pick up the baton and take it on themselves. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, Ron, I've finished. Are you wandering off to grab something to eat, are you? So what do we do next? RCMC, okay, sorry, MC.
Yeah, well, you can have a sit.
I can sit down, great, thanks.
And then we can have a quiet meditation.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, brothers. Drew, thank you. Thank you, William, for sharing that one. So I always call William my very own rabbi, Thank you very much. So this is now an opportunity for us to share. To share some of the good things that the good Lord has done for you during this past time that since we met. And also, even the not so good ones. All these are part of life. So this is time to share. And I understand one of our sisters volunteered to share something today. Our dear sister, Sister Inga. She's going to share something, and then after that, maybe one or two people will share. But here in this part of the country, we always love sharing. And that's another way of telling the story, as our brother just said. So thank you so much. Now, let's give hand to our sister as she comes to share for us. Thank you.
Ron told me, be prepared, Francis always wants to ask someone to share, and he convinced me that I try. Recently I went to Germany, and I met some of my generation brothers and sisters, blessed families, and I know them very well. And I know their children very well. And they had to tell me that their children just cannot forgive them. They're very resentful that they left them alone, and they preferred to do their mission. And of course, that because I know them so well, it makes you very sad. So then I had to go and help in a workshop, just on the side, not in the workshop myself. And I was very interested, at least the second gen, I knew when they came to say hello to me, or we had a little bit of time, I would ask them how they felt. And one particular sister, second gen, I said, how was it with your parents? How would you grade your parents? And she was so shocked. She said, that is, I don't know, that is a difficult question. But then she said, her dad was always on the sea, 2, 3, 4 months. But they had families of five families around. And then if it became too much for her mum, she would just send them to the other families, and she could relax, and the children were happy with the other children, right? So they shared with each other. And I was so happy about that, because a week or two before, I read in an old blessing quarterly, they don't exist anymore, but I just loved them. True Father, in the early beginnings of the church, he listened every night, through the whole night. He would listen to brothers and sisters, their concern or their problems. He wouldn't judge them, he just listened. An early member gave testimony about that in this blessing quarterly. And he would listen, sometimes would give an advice, and that happened every day. Till the congregation got so big, he was concerned and said, I can't do that anymore. We became too big. So he said, what about having trinities? You have a trinity. When you're not feeling well, or when your couple has problems, go and share it with the other couple. You know, get advice or get support. If you have financial support, difficulties, you can help each other. Or if somebody is sick, I thought that was such a brilliant idea. And I got reminded of that when that young person told me her story, that's exactly what they did. And I thought that is an amazing, great way of living, supporting each other. That's my story. Thank you.
One more testimony?
It's really linked to that. One day, anyway, I was teaching and talking about exactly that thing with Yebony some years ago, and she said that Ron often had to go to China and was often away for long periods of time. And she said what made it bearable was that he always said, I wish I didn't have to go, I would prefer just to be here at home with the family, with you. Whereas the second gen who are resentful are the ones where their parents loved the church more, they felt that my parents loved the church and the mission and going to all these conferences and going abroad more than they loved me. Whereas I realized, oh, that was a mistake I made. And I realized the incredible wisdom there was with you and with Ron and Inge about the way in which you explained this when you had to go abroad and how. And then I realized, yeah, it's so important then for, if you want to go and do a mission, to actually get your spouse and your children's blessing to go and do that. Otherwise, you shouldn't do it. Controversial.
Thank you very much. Let us stand up and sing our final song for today. By the Spring of Life. Yes, thank you. We've now come to the end of our service here in East London, and thank you so much for coming. Let us have time for refreshments and fellowship afterwards. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you.
Oh, you can't see them?